Okay, in this series, I'm presenting reasons. I have to turn this thing on. I'm presenting reasons to believe God exists that do not depend on the Bible being true. And if you're wanting Bible during Bible class, you're going to have to hang out for maybe another 4 or 5 weeks. And I'll get to it. You know I love teaching the Bible. But I just thought this was important for an apologetics reason for people to actually understand when somebody says, well, why do you believe this? And they accuse you of reasoning in a circle. Now, my contention last class, you'll recall if you were here, it's more reasonable to believe the universe was brought into existence by something than to believe it was not. And it's more reasonable to believe that this cause, this something, was a timeless, non-physical and immensely powerful personal being than to believe it was not. My contention in this class is it is more reasonable to believe there is an objective moral standard than to believe there is not, and it is more reasonable to believe that an objective moral standard cannot exist without God than to believe it can. Now, is the moral standard, is morality, is right and wrong objective or subjective? That's a crucial question. Is it objective or subjective? When you say it's wrong to slit a baby's throat for fun, do you mean it's inherently wrong? Wrong no matter who says otherwise? In that case, you mean it's objectively wrong. You see, the wrong inheres in the object, in the conduct itself. Or by calling that conduct wrong, do you mean it's merely contrary to current human opinion on the matter? Something that's subject to change, like clothing styles. Well, in that case, you mean it's subjectively wrong. The conduct is not wrong in itself, but is wrong only in the sense it's presently viewed by people as wrong. Its wrongness is dependent on the beholder's opinion of it rather than being a property of the act itself. Now, to focus the distinction, subjective or objective, to help focus that, if the Nazis, the bad guys in World War II, you didn't used to have to say that, but if the Nazis succeeded in conquering the world and convincing the masses that slaughtering Jewish children was the moral equivalent of exterminating cockroaches, would killing Jewish children still be wrong? If it became accepted that a father had absolute authority over his family, such that he had a right to sexually abuse his children or kill them for his enjoyment, would his doing so still be wrong? You see, the question is whether right and wrong is whatever people decide it is, or whether it exists transcendently, independently of what people think. Do we make it up, or do we discover it? Now, with many others, all those known as moral realists, with many others, I claim it's more reasonable to believe that slitting a baby's throat for fun is objectively wrong than to believe it merely goes against current human opinion, that it merely violates a personal taste or a social convention, like driving on the right-hand side of the road. It's more reasonable to believe it's objectively wrong. I'm convinced of this because our moral sense, our moral experience tells us it is objectively wrong, and we have reason to trust that moral sense. Virtually everybody has a powerful sense that this conduct is objectively wrong. Indeed, that strikes us as self-evident, a truth that needs no demonstration. For me to even say it probably strikes some of you as crazy. We perceive intuitively and from interacting with other people that there are moral facts, not simply subjective tastes and opinions, and that the wrongness of slitting a baby's throat for fun is an example of such a fact. Nothing can make it okay. One has to suppress that perception. One has to be in denial to claim otherwise. Now, the depth and the power of the sense we have that morality is objective is illustrated beautifully by Bertrand Russell, who was perhaps the most renowned atheist philosopher of the 20th century. Russell said, "I cannot see how to refute the arguments for the subjectivity of ethical values, but I find myself incapable of believing that all that is wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it." You see, he knew in his heart that there was more to the wrongness of wanton cruelty, such as slitting a baby's throat for fun, than his personal opinion. He knew there was more to it than that, but his atheism gave him no way to justify objective morality. So he says, I can't refute the arguments from an atheistic perspective. No, you can't. But I know. He says, but I'm incapable of believing that that's true. Well, that's very insightful. It's our sense that morality is objective that explains the disgust, the anger, the indignation that we feel over something like child molestation. I mean, if I can't stand the taste of sushi, which I can't, but somebody else really likes it, I don't get outraged or indignant toward them. I don't get all huffy about it because it's a subjective matter. It's a matter of taste. It's completely different if they rape a child. See, one has the inescapable conviction that a child rapist has not simply disagreed with one's personal preference, but has violated a transcendent, objective norm. He did wrong, capital W, regardless of who may disagree. And it's our sense that morality is objective that allows us to judge some human laws and accepted cultural practices as unjust or immoral. As Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his letter from a Birmingham jail, he says, a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. And likewise, an unjust cultural practice is one that is out of harmony with the moral law. I mean, if a culture approves of abandoning unwanted newborns to die, as did the ancient Roman society, we don't take their approval of the practice as the last word on whether it's moral. Well, they did it. They were fine with it. We don't do that. We appeal to a transcendent standard, something that is beyond human opinion, beyond culture, to judge whether the practice is moral. And that's what we're doing. We understand that there is an objective morality. And you say, okay, I get that there is this ubiquitous sense that slitting a baby's throat for fun is objectively wrong. I get that. We all have that feeling. We understand that. But is there any reason to believe that that sense that we have is accurate? Is there any reason to believe that that sense that we have is true? And there is. You see, it's reasonable to believe that perception is accurate because in the absence of sufficient evidence to the contrary, it's reasonable to believe our perceptions of reality are trustworthy. In other words, it's reasonable to assume that our grasp of reality is accurate until we have sufficient reason to think otherwise. The rational default position is that our perception corresponds to reality. For example, I'm justified in accepting that the world I perceive to exist through my senses does in fact exist, until I'm given sufficient evidence to the contrary. Perhaps a showing that I'm really just a brain in a vat that's been caused to hallucinate the perception of the world around me. And I'm justified in accepting that the minds I perceive to exist in other people, they do in fact exist. They're not simply automatons who act like they have minds. They have minds. And it's reasonable and appropriate for me to believe that until I have sufficient reason to deny it. You see, without such contrary evidence, it's reasonable for me to assume that my apprehension of reality is true. That's how we function. And that's true with my moral sense. Until I have sufficient reason to believe that that moral sense is not accurate, it's reasonable for me to trust it. Now, in the same way, it's reasonable for me to make that assumption about that moral sense until I have that evidence. But as Louise Antony said, she's a professor of philosophy at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, in her debate with William Lane Craig, she said, any argument for moral skepticism, this idea that I deny that there is an objective reality, any argument for moral skepticism is going to be based upon premises which are less obvious than the reality of moral values and duties themselves. So you're not going to have sufficient evidence to deny your moral sense. She says it therefore can never be rational to accept moral skepticism. There is no sufficient evidence for me to deny my moral experience, my moral sense, my apprehension that there is objective morality. Now, the fact that it's reasonable to believe that it is objectively wrong to slit a baby's throat for fun, that creates a problem for atheists. It creates a problem because the atheist has no reasonable way to account for objective morality. He has no good way to claim that any conduct, however egregious, however outrageous, is inherently wrong. Wrong in a sense independent of human opinion. After all, in the atheist view, all of existence, absolutely everything, is the product of blind, purposeless, natural forces. How could such forces generate moral obligation? How could they generate a moral standard? If blind, purposeless forces, such as wind or dripping water, carved marks in sandstone in the shape of DONOTEATGRAPES, and somebody then appealed to those marks to condemn those who ate grapes, well, that person would be ridiculed and taught that mankind is not obligated to obey the fortuities of nature. Mindless phenomena like wind and rain cannot create moral obligation. But if the prohibition against slitting a baby's throat for fun is the product of the same mindless forces as created the marks, "Do not eat grapes," it could be no more binding. Right? Any contrary sense you had would be an illusion, a fact that many atheist philosophers admit. When I tell you this, when I tell you that an atheist has no rational grounds for an objective morality, I'm not the Lone Ranger. Atheists know this, at least those who will tell the truth. Atheist philosopher, for instance, Richard Taylor, he's a philosopher. He taught at Brown, he taught at Columbia, he taught at the University of Rochester. Well, he wrote in 1985, the concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God. The words remain, but their meaning is gone. Though Richard Dawkins, like other atheists, he often appeals to moral absolutes. You see, they're oftentimes inconsistent. But in November of 1995, he wrote in Scientific American, he said, "The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." And he said the following in an interview with Justin Brierley in 2008. Brierley says, "But if we had evolved into a society in which rape was considered fine, would that mean that rape is fine?" I don't want to answer that question. It's enough for me to say that we live in a society where it's not considered fine. He said, okay, but ultimately, your belief that rape is wrong is as arbitrary as the fact that we evolved 5 fingers rather than 6. You could say that, yes. The atheist philosopher Michael Ruse, he wrote in 2010, "God is dead, so why should I be good?" The answer is that there are no grounds whatsoever for being good. There is no celestial headmaster who's going to give you 6 or 6 billion of the best if you're bad. Morality is flim-flam. Now you know that morality is an illusion put in place by your genes to make you a social cooperator. What's to stop you from behaving like ancient Roman, grabbing Sabine women? Well, nothing. In an objective sense, nothing. This is not a secret. Atheist Joel Marks, who's professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of New Haven, he wrote in the Philosophy Now journal in 2010, he says, "I've given up morality altogether." Now, this is a professor of philosophy emeritus. So when I tell you that being an atheist gives you no basis for grounding objective morality, I'm not the Lone Ranger. Okay? He says, "I've given up morality altogether." This philosopher has long been laboring under an unexamined assumption, namely that there is such a thing as right and wrong. I now believe there isn't. How I arrived at this conclusion is the subject of a book I've written. The long and short of it is that I became convinced that atheism implies amorality. And since I'm an atheist, I must therefore embrace amorality. I experienced my shocking epiphany that the religious fundamentalists are correct. Without God, there is no morality. But they're incorrect. I still believe about there being a God. Hence, I believe there's no morality. Even though words like sinful and evil come naturally to the tongue as a description of, say, child molesting, they do not describe any actual properties of anything. There are no literal sins in the world because there is no literal God, and hence the whole religious superstructure that would include such categories as sin and evil. Just so, I now maintain, nothing is literally right or wrong because there is no capital M morality. There is no objective morality. Alex Rosenberg is the R. Taylor Cole Professor of Philosophy at Duke University. In his book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality, Rosenberg says, everyone seems to know what life's persistent questions are. This book aims to provide the correct answers to most of the persistent questions. Here's a list of some of the questions and their short answers. Is there a God? No. What is the nature of reality? What physics says it is. What is the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? There is no moral difference between them. In April 2013, David Silverman, who was the head of an organization known as American Atheist, in his debate with Frank Turek, Silverman said, there is no such thing as objective morality. All morality is relative. There is no objective moral standard. He also said that his preferring a culture that cares for babies rather than eating them, and his condemnation of Nazi atrocities was just, quote, an opinion. And he agreed that people have every right to do what, in his opinion, is wrong. Now, atheists who attempt to find a basis for objective morality, they are driven to incoherence. They're driven to incoherence. And a prime example is the atheist philosopher Michael Ruse. Now, Ruse says, on the one hand, Ruse says, the man who says it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Well, that's objective. Right? I mean, yeah, just like that. I mean, that's crazy. 2 + 2 we know is a fact, an objective fact. It's 4. The guy who says it's 5, this person who says it's okay to rape children is just as mistaken as that guy. He's objectively wrong. He says, I want to say that Jerry Sandusky, you know, the guy up at Penn State years ago, I want to say that what Jerry Sandusky was reportedly doing to kids in the showers was morally wrong, and that this was not just an opinion or something based on subjective value judgments. The truth of its wrongness is as well taken as the truth of the heliocentric solar system. Objective, right? That's what he's saying. It's objective. So that's Ruse on the one hand. And then we have Ruse on the other hand. So morality has to come across as something that is more than emotion. It has to appear to be objective, even though really it's subjective. It's subjective. Well, how about that? So he claims, you see, that evolution, it's fooled us into thinking that certain behavior is objectively wrong. So all this talk about is objective. It's like 2 + 2 = No, it's not an opinion. It's objective. But you know what? It's really subjective, and the idea that it's objective has simply been fobbed off on us by our genes. It really is subjective, but we've been made to think by that clever wascal, evolution. We've been made to think that it's objective. And the atheist philosopher Alex Rosenberg, he concurs in that assessment. He says, our core morality isn't true, right, correct, neither's any other. Nature just seduced us into thinking it's right. It did that because that made core morality work better. Our believing in its truth increases our individual genetic fitness. All right, so Ruse and many other atheists, they ask us to deny our innate sense that morality is objective on the basis of their dubious assertions that all that exists is matter and physics, and that naturalistic evolution not only has created human minds, but has also commandeered those minds to generate false impressions of reality. Now that's a big pill to swallow. That's a big pill to swallow, and it's one they stuff down only because their naturalistic worldview demands it. To echo that philosopher Louise Anthony that I read a little bit ago, certainly these claims are less obvious than the reality of moral values and duties themselves. Moreover, if that's the case, now that we've pierced the evolutionary illusion, right? So we sit here and say, look, no, it's objective. Well, it's not really objective. It's subjective, and you're being faked out to believe it's objective. Okay? Because evolution has commandeered your mind to give you this false impression of reality. Okay? Well, now that we have pierced the veil, now that we have transcended and we see the truth, we've pierced the evolutionary illusion, we've realized the truth that there is no objective moral standards, but only personal tastes and social conventions. Why perpetuate the falsehood with double talk? Why do that? Why not free people from the false perception our genes have fobbed off on us? Why not liberate them from the guilt they carry for having committed what they falsely believed were objective moral wrongs? I mean, after all, if somebody was racked with guilt, if they were racked with guilt because they thought that stepping on a crack on the sidewalk was immoral, we would seek to enlighten them, right? We would try to say, no, you're wrong. What you did wasn't wrong. You need to lighten up. Okay, well, now that we've pierced the evolutionary illusion, why isn't it our duty to let people know that? But nobody's doing that. And they're doing it because they know it's a lie. That's why they're not doing it. And of course, we can't stop at thinking that evolution has tricked us into believing that morality is objective. Why do we stop there? If it's got this great power to commandeer minds and give false impressions, if we have to deny our sense of objective morality on the fantastic theory that it is a genetically induced mirage, we have no less reason to deny that the love that we are certain we experience with our spouses and our children, that's also a mirage. That's a mirage. It's not there. It's just something. It's a genetically induced mirage. There's no reality to that. Now, will you accept that? Or will you know that's nonsense? No, I know that there's something to that. Or are you just going to say, no, it's just been fobbed off on you? Now, atheist charges notwithstanding, it's perfectly rational and reasonable to hold to the reality of these perceptions rather than to think that we are the deluded pawns of a blind and random process that shows no capacity to achieve such a fantastic effect. It is very reasonable to believe this. Very, very reasonable. Now, I submit to you that Michael Ruse's incoherence, it reflects his inability to believe that all that's wrong with child molestation is that he personally has been programmed by his genes not to like it, to perceive it as wrong. See, he knows by intuition and by experience that there's more to it than that. But his atheism gives him no way to explain how there can be more to it than that. He's just like Bertrand Russell. He's caught. Everything about him is telling that this is real, these are moral facts, this is objective, but his assumptions, his philosophy gives him nothing on which to hang objective morality. So he speaks out of both sides of his mouth, claiming it is not an opinion or a subjective value judgment, and yet insisting it is a subjective judgment that we've been fooled into believing is objective. Now, to me, it's almost funny watching atheists express moral indignation and outrage, which they do a lot. You see, I mean, they do a lot. It's almost funny watching them express moral indignation and outrage over certain conduct, especially when they think they can blame that conduct on religion. Oh, they, just really, this is outrageous, this is terrible. You see? You feel like, what are you talking about? For you, it's just like, somebody likes peanut butter and you don't. You see? Now, in May 2007, there was a debate in Christianity Today with the atheist Christopher Hitchens and the Christian theist Douglas Wilson. And in that debate, Wilson kept pressing Hitchens. He kept pressing him for a rational basis for labeling any conduct good or bad. He wants to know, what is the rationale for that? What is the rational basis? What allows you as an atheist to say that something is good or bad? I mean, if existence consists solely of matter acting according to various laws of nature, it's meaningless to speak of conduct as either good or bad. It simply is, right? It simply is. I mean, we might as well say it's good for a flower to be yellow, but bad for a flower to be red. I mean, all such declarations, they're necessarily arbitrary and meaningless. If everything's just perking out matter and laws over time, right? Everything is just the way it is. There is no basis for it. Now, the best that Hitchens could muster in answer to this persistent inquiry by Wilson was to say that, quote, our morality evolved. That was his answer. Pushed him all over the place. Finally, what I've said before, our morality evolved. Well, that's the standard tack that's taken by atheists who want to keep their atheism and also feel justified in their moral condemnation of others. So they don't want to give up and surrender the idea that I can condemn things, but they also don't want to give up their atheism. So they think they have a solution. I'll just say our morality evolved. But I think Wilson did a beautiful job of exposing the fatal defect in that claim. Now let me read to you what he says. It's several slides, 4 I think, but hang with me because I think it's worth it. Wilson says, on the question of morality, you again attempt an answer. Now he's quoting Hitchens. My answer is the same as it was all along. Our morality evolved. Okay, back to Wilson. There are 2 points to be made about this reply. The first concerns evolved morality and the future, and is a variation on my previous questions. If our morality evolved, then that means our morality changes. If evolution isn't done yet, and why should it be, then that means our morality is involved in this ongoing flux as well. And that means that everything we consider to be, quote, moral is really up for grabs. Our, quote, vague yet grand conception of human rights might flat disappear just like our gills did. Our current, quote, morals are therefore just a way station on the road. No sense getting really attached to them, right? When I'm traveling, I don't get attached to motel rooms. I don't weep when I have to part from them. So in the future, after every ferocious moral denunciation you choose to offer your reading public, you really need to add something like, but this is just a provisional judgment. Our perspective may evolve to an entirely different one some years hence, or provisional opinions only, morality changes over time. Pumkat for short. And he says it would look like this. The Reverend Snoutworthy's an odious little toad, not to mention a waste of skin, and his proposal that we prosecute the brassiere editors of the Sears catalog on pornography and racketing charges is an outrage against civilized humanity. But, Pumkat. Now this relates to the second point, which concerns our evolved morality and the past. When dealing with people whose moral judgments have differed from yours, do you regard them as immoral or as less evolved? The rhetoric of your book, your tone in these exchanges, and your recent dancing on the grave of the late Jerry Falwell would all seem to indicate the former. In your choice of words, the people you denounce are to be blamed. The word fulminations comes to mind. You write like a witty but acerbic 10th century archbishop with a bad case of the gout. But this is truly an odd thing to do if morality is simply derivative of evolution. Are you filled with fierce indignation that the koala bear hasn't evolved ears that stick flat to the side of his head like they're supposed to? Or are you wroth over the fact that clams don't have legs yet? When you notice that the bears at the zoo continue to suck on their paws, do you stop to remonstrate with them? You see, and this is what you're getting with this idea. It's not even responsive. You're saying, how are you going to what is the rational basis for you labeling conduct meaningfully bad? Not just your personal taste, not just a social convention, really bad that justifies and warrants your indignation and anger and outrage. Well, morality evolved. But that's no answer. And that's where you are. That's what you wind up with. People saying, well, morality simply evolved. Now, because atheism is incompatible with the existence of objective morality, our moral sense bears witness to the falsity of atheism. Our understanding, that deep sense that Russell says, I can't accept that all that's wrong with wanton cruelty is that I don't like it. This sense that there is an objective wrong that is manifested and our using it to judge things of cultures and laws and all of that. This sense here, that is bearing witness to the falsity of atheism. It's telling us at a profound experiential level that atheism is not true. In the atheist's insistence that one is to reject this clear moral sense as an illusion, I hear the old line, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? That's what I think's going on. Now, the question is not whether atheists can be good people. Okay, don't confuse those things. That's not the question. Of course they can be good people. Certainly they can. After all, they've been made in God's image. And they have a certain moral awareness or sensitivity as a result of being made in God's image. This is the law of the heart that Paul refers to in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. The question's whether they can have a rational basis for affirming that morality is objective. And they can't. They're left to view the enforcement of any behavioral standard. They are left to view the enforcement of any behavioral standard as the imposition of one person or one group's personal preference on another. You see, in that scheme, there are no wrongdoers in any true sense. There aren't wrongdoers in any true sense. There are only those whose opinions are in a minority. Everything is political. You see, if that's the case, it really is a world of might makes right. If I've got the force, the people that agree with my perception of this, then I will condemn that. If the tables turn and eating children becomes wonderful, then we'll condemn you. It's who's got the power in the society to enforce the behavior. There is nothing out there. We're just in an internal war. That's false. Okay, that's something that's false. Now, atheists sometimes try to undermine this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I've only got 4 minutes, but I'll just say they sometimes bring up what's called the Euthyphro dilemma. Okay, and if you want to know more about that, because I've got a couple pages on that, and I don't have the time to talk about it. But they sometimes, basically the idea, what it boils down to in terms of Judeo-Christian monotheism, is the question, is something good because God commands it? In other words, is that the only reason? Just because he commanded it? Or does God command something because it's good? And they think they've got the theist caught on a dilemma here, but there's a third way out of that, which is known. It's a classic example. And then they have something they say about that, and then there's a response to that. Okay? So, I don't have time to do that. If you're interested in it, I can direct you to some places to do that. But we got 3 minutes to go, so enjoy yourselves.